Welcome to week 7 of HOS 121. This week we are talking about psychosocial development in early childhood, and lecture 7.1 will cover how emotions are developed and also how children come to understand the emotions of others. So we'll begin by talking about Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, and we'll talk about the two stages that fall within early childhood. And then we'll talk about how children develop basic and then complex emotions, and how they come to understand the emotions of others, and also how this development of emotions and understanding of the emotions of others relates to the development of attachment that we talked about last week in lecture 6.3. Erikson's second stage of psychosocial development is the stage of autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this happens during the toddler years from about age 1 to about age 3. And the task is to achieve a degree of autonomy while minimizing shame and doubt. So autonomy is like independence, a sense of independence. So if mom and dad or other caretakers that come into the picture now, which can include child care providers and teachers, if these caretakers permit the child, who's a toddler, to explore and manipulate his or her environment, the child will develop a sense of autonomy or independence. And connected to our discussion of attachment, we've talked about the idea of a secure base and a safe haven. So that's the idea that children will look back to the attachment figure, who can be a mom or dad, or parent, or a secondary attachment figure who might be a caregiver, like at a child care center, or a grandparent or someone like that. So children will look back at these attachment figures knowing that they're there, and that gives them the comfort to explore. So if children have that, or are allowed to take the lead, have the freedom to explore, then they can develop a sense of autonomy. But on the other hand, it's possible at this stage that children can develop a sense of shame and doubt. These are both complex emotions that we'll talk about later in this lecture. So if an attachment figure like a parent comes down hard on an attempt to explore and be independent, children may give up and assume that they cannot or should not act on their own. So it's important to keep that in mind if you're, with a toddler, and not to laugh at their efforts when they're trying to exert some independence. And then there are other ways that children can learn shame and doubt. If a parent does something for the child that they should learn to do for themselves, you give the impression that the child is not good for much. So if the child is trying to do up their shoes, rather than just getting impatient and doing it for them, it's better to let that child learn how to do for themselves, because that's what they're learning in this stage, is to become independent. Shame and doubt sound negative, but they're really those complex emotions that we need in terms of evaluating our own behavior. So that keeps us from doing things like running around naked in public or jumping off of buildings. You need that sense of, is my behavior correct? So if you get that balance right, of autonomy and shame or doubt, then you will develop the virtue or the strength of will, or willpower and determination. So if you think about toddlers, one of the most admirable things about them is their determination, their can-do, their willingness to sort of jump in and try something new. And if you can preserve that can-do attitude with some balance in terms of modesty and some caution, then you're better off as an adult. The third stage of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development is the stage of initiative versus guilt. And this is the stage during the preschool years, from ages about 3 to age 6. And the task during this time is to learn initiative without too much guilt. So guilt is another complex emotion. Initiative means a positive response to the world's challenges. So taking on responsibilities, learning new skills, feeling purposeful. Parents can encourage initiative by encouraging children to try out their ideas. So at this age, we'll talk about this in a later lecture, children are beginning to do fantasy play, and they can have a lot of curiosity and imagination, and children learn through play at this age, not formal education. So children are capable, as never before, of imagining a future situation, one that's not a reality right now, and taking initiative to make that, to take the idea in their head and make it a reality. But if children can imagine the future and if they can start to plan at this age, they can also start to develop responsibility. And if they can develop responsibility, then they can develop guilt as well. So, if a really young child, if a 2-year-old does something like flushes a watch down the toilet, that they're not necessarily having evil intentions. They're just, seeing a shiny object going around and around as it goes down the toilet. And that's sort of fun. But if a 5-year-old does the same thing, by that age, they know about consequences. They know what's going to happen to the watch. They know that, it's going to make someone mad and what's going to happen to the child and get punished. So a child can start feeling guilty and acting guilty in terms of the act and feeling that sense of guilt for having done something. So this is also when the capacity for moral judgment has arrived. So do we need guilt? So guilt is another complex emotion. It's around comparing our behavior to a certain standard. And we do need guilt. If you think about it, the only people who don't have guilt are people we call psychopaths. If they've done something that harms someone else and don't feel any sense of guilt. So you need a balance. And so a good balance in terms of initiative and guilt it leads to the strength of purpose. So a sense of purpose is something that many people crave in their lives, but don't necessarily realize that they make their own purpose in terms of having imagination, envisioning something, and taking initiative. So, it's part of it is also having then courage to sort of act. And so that's all of that is developing here in terms of initiative, taking initiative and taking on challenges, new responsibilities, and new kinds of learning. So why do we develop emotions? So I've already alluded to the idea of that there are such things as basic and complex emotions. But what are emotions? So emotions really are, you can think of them as a language of our mental state. So it's a way that we are expressing something in terms of how we are feeling on the inside. And basic emotions, which we'll talk about in a minute, they consist of different aspects. So first there's a subjective feeling. So it's a feeling that we can label happiness or sadness, for example. And a physiological change. So you can think about what does your body feel like when you have an emotion like sadness. You might feel sort of your posture might become more hunched. You might be holding back tears. If you feel fear, you'll have a certain kind of more frozen type of affect in your body. And it's associated with different physical expressions too. So those are the overt behaviors. So you can tell when somebody is frightened. You can tell when someone's happy. When someone's truly happy, there are signs that you can pick up on in terms of the kinds of smile they'll have, smiling with the eyes, for example. So emotions are the way we express what's going on for us, and there's an internal state, and it also is reflected in terms of how we look and our appearance, our physical facial features. And emotions have an adaptive value in terms of enabling people to function within their social environments and their relationships. So basically it's the way that we give cues to others and we get cues from our environment, and that then influences our behavior. So the book gives this example of, if you're walking down a dark street late at night and you start feeling the emotion of fear, how does it then affect your behavior? So you might then be more cautious. You'd be organizing your behavior around avoiding danger. So you would, pull your belongings closer to yourself, walk more purposefully, maybe hold something like your keys, that you can defend yourself. So emotions let us respond to an environment. So for in that example, an environment that may potentially hold a risk, or it helps us have a relationship. So if you see people who are, relating in a positive way, they're smiling, they're mirroring each other's facial expressions and emotions, and that's a way that we can form connections with others. So emotions enable us to adapt to our social environments and to our relationships. We develop basic emotions in the first year of life, and it's clear that these 6 emotions, have their roots in terms of in nature, in terms of biological heredity. So these are universal emotional expressions, and that suggests that we are biologically programmed to express these 6 emotions. And research has shown that infants and adults worldwide express basic emotions in the same way in terms of their facial expressions. So, for example, you notice with a child on the far left upper corner, with interest, there's the signs that you can look for, or the brow raised, and the mouth may be rounded, or the lips may be pursed. It's a sign of interest. Whereas the child who's expressing disgust in the upper right corner, the tongue is protruding, the nose is wrinkled. Those are clear signs of some kind of feeling of disgust. So each of these expressions has recognizable features. The child who's expressing joy in the bottom right corner has bright eyes, her mouth is smiling, her cheeks are lifted. Whereas the baby then with sadness is the corners of his mouth are turned down, the inner portion of his brows are raised, and you can tell, comparing sadness and joy, what emotion is going on for those children. So again, these emotions, they emerge early in life, and they have a biological basis. The first emotions that develop are just the basic ones of pleasure and distress in newborns. So you see in newborns, it's a memory for many parents when their baby first smiles at them, like first gives them a social smile, not just a smile from the relief of passing gas. The social smile comes around 2 to 3 months, and it's the way that the newborn shows pleasure and interest in a human being, the enjoyment of seeing another person's face, and that becomes the emotion of joy or happiness, those early expressions of pleasure. And then distress, of course babies show a lot of signs of distress, and sometimes they're showing signs of unhappiness, discomfort, not getting their needs met in some way, and so those signs of distress are early versions of what would ultimately become sadness as a basic emotion. Then other emotions join that repertoire, it broadens from just basic pleasure and distress to have things like anger. So, anger develops around 4 months, 4 to 6 months of age, and the infant can show anger if their favorite toy is taken away or their favorite food. So once the infant starts to understand goal-directed behavior, the infant becomes angry when its attempts to achieve a goal are frustrated. So when a parent, for example, restrains an infant from picking up a toy, when they start wanting things and you are getting in the way of what they want, you'll see an infant will express anger. Interest is, simply when they start to develop interest, curiosity, engagement with the toy, with the person. You'll see those signs of the brow lifted, the mouth sort of showing interest, pursed or forming an O. So babies start becoming engaged with people and other aspects of their environment. So fear, we're going to talk more about fear. Fear is related to stranger wariness, which really comes around 6 months, 6 to 9 months, when children begin to feel, show signs of fear when there are unfamiliar adults around. We'll come back to that. And then disgust also develops around the age of 6 months, and that is adaptive. As we talked about, emotions are adaptive because they help us respond to an environment or a relationship, and disgust is helpful in terms of it's an emotion that we feel in relation to something that's toxic, like feces, for example, or potential illness like vomit. So children might have a expression of disgust when they've just had a poo in their diaper, or they've just thrown up, and they've had that taste in their mouths. You might see an expression of disgust. So I'd like to say something more about stranger wariness, which is one of the first signs of the development of the basic emotion of fear. And first of all, it's adaptive. So as I mentioned, the idea of emotions is that they are adaptive because they let us function within our environments and within our relationships. And fear that develops around 6 to 9 months happens. Its development tracks when children start to be able to move themselves by creeping along on their stomachs or crawling, and so it's adaptive at that point that they develop a sense of fear around separation from their attachment figure, or being around new people who they don't know and don't have that trust established with, that happens in the first year, according to Erickson. So The emotion of fear is fully developed by 9 months, and we see stranger wariness, with the infant displaying cautiousness and wariness around unfamiliar people, and also separation distress, where they don't want to be separated from the attachment figure. And that those two expressions of fear peak somewhere around 12 to 15 months, and then they tend to decline from around 14, 15 months as the child has developed that internal working model of attachment and that knowledge that, okay, my mother or father is leaving me here in childcare, but they're going to come back. They're going to come back for me, so I don't need to worry. So it connects to the, this expression of stranger wariness and separation distress connects to the true or clear-cut phase of attachment, when children are expressing those core characteristics of attachment, which include separation distress that we talked about in lecture 6.3. And it's really because at this time infants begin to realize that not all people are the same, and that they have a special person or more than one special person, and that relationship is important. And so again, that there's that adaptive quality of stranger wariness and separation distress, that fear that comes up for infants. Hey, don't leave me. I need you. Don't leave me with this person. I don't know if I can trust this person. So these are adaptive emotions for the infant. So after the emergence of basic emotions, then we start to see the emergence of complex or secondary emotions that come out in the toddler years. And these emotions require the child to have some self-awareness and consciousness of adult reactions. So because they're really about self-conscious types of emotions that are the child interpreting how they've met a standard or if they've failed to meet a standard. So there are things like shame, which relates to Erikson's second stage of development around shame and doubt, feelings of guilt for not having done something, having done something that was morally wrong, not meeting a moral standard, embarrassment, having not done something that makes them feel badly about themselves in terms of self-esteem, or pride, having achieved something. So these emotions start coming as children develop more of a sense of who they are as a separate person. So again, those complex emotions depend on the child having a sense of themselves and having self-awareness. And this is it's a difficult area to do research on because, of course, we're talking about very young children when children start to develop self-awareness. And you can't do a lot of the kinds of research studies we talked about in week 2 where you interview them, even observation. These are internal types of psychological experiences, and they're hard to learn about. So it's theorized just from observing infants that very young children, before 3 months and 4 months in that range, do not even have a sense of themselves that is separate from their caregivers, from their attachment figure, their primary attachment figure. They see themselves as being part of their mothers most often. But then as children get older, then they start to realize that they are distinct from other people. And there's this emerging sense of me, mine, those are the words you hear so often with toddlers, and that fosters those self-conscious emotions, which are the complex emotions. And up in the upper right-hand corner in the slide, you can see an image of a child. You may be able to tell it's really small, but a child with a mirror. And one way they've tried to actually look at when do children develop self-awareness is doing something called the Rouge test. So this is an observational experimental research study where you take children into a lab and you basically, you try to make it a nice lab with some toys, but you have the child there and then you put a bit of rouge on their face somewhere and you try to get them to look in the mirror and see how they react to that mark. Do they realize that it's on their own face and then try to rub it off, or are they trying to touch the face, in the mirror and just thinking it's another child? But it's hard to know what's being measured in a study like that, really. It's, is it really that it's showing signs of self-awareness? That's how it's been used. But again, it's a difficult topic for us to research because with very young children, we can't do with a lot of the kinds of things that we do to research human development, like ask people about their internal psychological states. So something else that's important that happens in early childhood in terms of emotions is how children start to develop emotional regulation. So as they start to feel those strong emotions, those strong basic emotions, they need to learn some ways to control those emotions, and particularly the expression of those emotions, so that they are appropriate. If every time we got upset about something, we just started yelling, it would be very hard to then function in society. So emotional regulation is something that we need to learn in order to function within our relationships and our environments. And we see very young children doing this from age 4 to 6 months, just using very simple strategies around emotional regulation. A common one is to avert their gaze, so turning away from scary images or from stimuli, even a person who's overly stimulating, just trying to kind of disengage to keep, to get their emotional arousal down. And then as children get a bit older, they also learn how to label their emotions and what kinds of emotions are more likely to get a response. So your reading talks about at 24 months, young children more often express sadness than fear and anger, because the research suggests that is more likely to evoke the kinds of response they might want from a parent. And then this becomes more sophisticated as children get older. And so, children are increasingly able to regulate their own emotions and not rely on others to control their emotions for them. And it's a very important competency to develop, really, this skill around emotional regulation. Poor emotional regulation can be a risk factor for a number of outcomes, whereas good emotional regulation can be a protective factor. So you can think about outcomes like delinquency or impulsive behavior and risk taking. That having poor emotional regulations can make it more likely that you're going to get involved in something like that, or violent behavior. Whereas if you're able to control your emotions, that's protective in terms of functioning well. It's also protective in terms of having good relationships with others. So another important part of emotional development, after the development of basic emotions and then complex emotions and the development of the ability to regulate those emotions and control their expression, another important thing about emotional development is how we come to understand that other people have emotions. So how is it that we come to understand that other people have emotions? So you can see that in babies, from 4 months up to 6, 7 months, there's been research that suggests that they can interpret facial expressions, particularly those that are related to the basic emotions of fear and sadness and happiness, that they can distinguish between those expressions. So if you take a baby into a lab, there's one study described in your reading, and play a happy voice, the baby will look at the happy face. And then there's other studies I've looked at that the babies will look more intently at negative expressions like anger, which makes sense if you think about a baby where they may need to attend more to that kind of emotion, because they may, that person might be a source of a threat of some kind if they're angry at you. So, that's one aspect of emotional development, is coming to recognize what people's facial expressions are, though a young infant may not really know what they mean, but they're able to distinguish between them. This is a happy face, this is an angry face, this is a fearful face, though they may not get the significance of it. And then another thing that you see in infants and toddlers is social referencing. And I've talked about this before in reference to attachment. So infants and toddlers will often use their attachment figure and the emotions of their attachment figure to figure out how they should react in a situation. So here's a new situation, someone comes to the door, look to mom or dad, how's mom and dad reacting? Are they happy to see this person? Are they scared? What's going on? Or bringing a child, the infant or toddler, to a new space, and then they'll look to mom and dad, am I safe here? Am I safe to go run around? Is this a good place? So children will use the emotions of their caregivers to interpret a situation and to direct their own behavior. And they also will often match the emotions of their caregiver. So for example, if there's a situation that's hard to interpret, so you have like a an older child and they have their friend over and they're sort of talking loudly and then they start to wrestle, an infant or toddler might look to the mother to see how's the mother reacting, and if the mother is looking angry or if the mother's looking happy or fine, like this is just kind of a joke because they're playing, then the child can bring their emotions sort of in line with that. So seeing a happy expression on the mother, the child will often adopt that expression as well. And that's also a way that children start to regulate their emotions in terms of what's appropriate in a particular social context. And then as emotions get more complex, children begin to understand that others also have these emotions going on. They start to understand the significance of the emotions of others. And there's a concept called theory of mind, which I was surprised is not really discussed in your reading, but there's a lot of research now in this area. It's a lot of interest in human development around this concept of theory of mind, particularly in relation to certain things like conditions where there's an impairment of theory of mind, such as autism, where people with autism don't have trouble with this idea of holding someone else's mind in your own mind. That's the idea of theory of mind. It's being able to understand that others have mental states, they have beliefs, they have intents, desires, knowledge that are like your own, but that are different from your own. And so, it's how children kind of reason through that other people have a mind different from one's own mind. And again, this idea of being able to hold their mind in your mind, what's going on for that person, what's their intent, what's their desire, et cetera. So, that's again where it gets a bit more complex as children begin to develop this understanding of what's going on for others as well as for themselves. So why is it important to understand the emotions of others? So as the cognitive and language abilities of toddlers increase, they start to get a better sense of the feelings and goals and motives of others, and that connects to this idea of theory of mind. And there's a relationship here with the fourth phase of attachment. So I talked about this in lecture 6.3, these different phases of attachment, and the fourth final phase is the goal-corrected partnership. And at that stage, the child is starting to get a sense of their attachment figure, like their parent, understanding that person, has feelings and goals and plans, and that you can take that into account. Like, mommy has to work sometimes, or, daddy's going to go on a trip, but daddy will come home. Like, there are things going on with others, and that getting to understand that, enables the child to have more of a partnership with the attachment relationship. So they can take an initiative in interactions, they can negotiate with the parent, and they can deal with separation more effectively because they know that the parent will come back or the attachment figure will come back. And this also is related to the idea of the internal working model of attachment, because children start to internalize their attachment experience. They don't have to have that parent around all the time, so they don't have to have separation distress all the time. They can know, my mom or my dad, they'll take care of me. They will take care of me. I'm here at childcare now, but that's okay. So you'll start to see that with young children, that they can be more comfortable when they can separate. And also, being able to understand the emotions of others is also important in terms of another important relationship that comes in early childhood, which I'll talk about later, which is the relationship with peers. So children who are more skilled than other children at interpreting displays of emotion are higher in social competence. So they're better able to form and maintain relationships, like friendships, with their peers. So we're going to stop this lecture here, and then we're going to move on now and talk about an important context in early childhood, which is early childhood education and care, or childcare.